Okay, so this is the vlog for May 26th, and it's cold in here. We've been leaving the windows open because it was very warm. Not this week, but last week, and by gum, we're going to be ready for the next time it's warm, so the windows are open. I finally closed the window in my room today, but I'm probably going to have to open it up this weekend. Tomorrow is supposed to be super nice. I'm going to go to a car thing with my dad. I think I might have mentioned that one already. But today I made a me day, and I went to see Deadpool 2, not Solo. I'm going to see Solo with Dad on Monday. I'm going to go in the middle of the day. Won't be any kids around, hopefully, and it should be enjoyable. Deadpool 2 was not a movie I wanted to see with my dad, and I feel vindicated in that choice. And I don't know, maybe I'm just getting older, but some of the gore was just really hard to swallow. It was really gross. Um, but it was a funny movie. I mean, credit where credit is due. The jokes were really good. The story was weird and disjointed, but that was on purpose. It was an homage to the old X-Force comics, and they also pulled no punches in slandering, or rather, making fun of gently Rob Liefeld as the creator of Deadpool and Cable, since Deadpool and Cable are the two main characters in the film. Rob Liefeld is famous in the comic book industry for having a very strange idea of how perspective and body shape are supposed to work. There's a rather famous image of Captain America that he drew. If you look for it on the internet, you will find it. Just Google weird looking Captain America, and I'm sure it will be the first thing that pops up. But Deadpool and Cable are pretty interesting because actually I don't know that he created Cable. I know that he created Deadpool, but I'm not sure that Liefeld himself created Cable. Although it's worth noting, Rob Liefeld was a huge fan of what is it? Deathlock, the Exterminator, the Terminator, a guy who's called Slade these days in the DC universe, and the fact that Deadpool is Wade Wilson is a not subtle reference to who inspired the character originally. Deadpool has gone on to become much more popular than Deathstroke. It was Deathstroke the Terminator, or something like that. Yeah, everybody knows who Deadpool is these days, but Deathstroke is not quite as famous. You see, you do a Deathstroke in a Deadpool. That's how that. But when he was created, Deadpool was a serious character. He was supposed to be this sort of. He talked a lot. That's how he got the nickname Merc with a Mouth. But he wasn't really funny so much as just this guy who acted like a ninja, had swords, used guns, basically seemed like the kind of character that you imagine when you're 14 years old and you really like comics, which is probably where he came from. Well, we know where he came from, but that's probably why he was the way he was. It wasn't until writers other than Rob Liefeld got a hold of Deadpool that the sort of comedic spin and fourth wall breaking and voices talking to themselves and narrating himself and all that stuff, that came later. And that was actually what really made the character popular. My first ever exposure to him was in a comic called Agent X, and the titular Agent X was supposed by many fans to be Deadpool in disguise, or having lost his memory, or both, until Deadpool shows up in the comic about 6 issues in to settle the score and make it clear who Agent X actually is, which is more complicated than it needed to be. Well, that was the first time I ever ran into Deadpool in a comic book. The very first Marvel comic I ever had was a gift I got from my parents that I think it wasn't actually an X Force comic from the 90s. That was the first Marvel comic I ever owned, and I read it front to back a couple of times. There's a character in there called Shatterstar, and he makes an appearance in this movie as a sort of weird cameo. He was a goofy character, had swords with two blades that were parallel to one another. That seems to defeat the purpose of a bladed weapon, but what do I know? It was a weird comic because there wasn't any action in it, and I think that sort of says a lot about what the comics industry was going through in the 90s as they sort of moved away from, there had to be action in every story. Every story had to be a sort of an adventure, an amazing story, which was the original set of comics where a lot of Marvel superheroes appeared. And it sort of embraced the idea that comic books are basically soap operas for young boys. You think about it, all the drama, all the, oh no, so-and-so is dead, but actually they're alive. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's the same sort of stories that you see in soap operas, just with some action sometimes. So the fact that you now get these movies like Deadpool, where there is a fair bit of action, but a lot of talking, a lot of jokes, a lot of really fun jokes. I'm not going to spoil anything for you. But yeah, gosh, that's so funny. My favorite Marvel comic line has always been X-Men, because when I read X-Force and then later got into X-Men because of like the cartoon, the whole notion of being so let's set the record straight. Back in the 60s when the X-Men got started, the whole idea of mutants being treated differently from people was an allegory for the race issues of the day. Marvel Comics was very smart about introducing social issues into their comics, and sort of letting that be, the story. They were very good at telling action stories and Spider-Man swooping in to save people and his web line and all that stuff. But one of the most famous Spider-Man comics of all time is a comic where Spider-Man's friend is on drugs and Peter Parker, not Spider-Man, is trying to help him and realizing how much more difficult it is to save someone from a drug addiction than to save them from a burning building if you're Spider-Man. And likewise, mutants being treated as outcasts, outsiders, simply by the circumstances of their birth and a strange genetic thing is, very much the same as treating somebody different because their genetics make their skin a different color. But over time, it has come to be something more than that, because you aren't going to... The risk of being sort of hand-wavy about all the racial stuff, comics weren't being sold exclusively to young African-American people in the 60s and 70s, so they needed something to make this comic sell to everybody. And so over time, the X-Men became a metaphor for feeling like you don't fit in when you're young, which is something that all these characters have in common, and that most of us growing up in America have in common because of the way the public school system works. And that definitely struck a chord with me. I could see all the different sort of social things that I was going through as a kid, as a teenager, going on with these X-Men characters. And especially when I graduated high school and I worked briefly in a place that sold comics, and I started to really understand the stories that were being told, it was genius. It was very clever and very well done, with a couple exceptions. And I've just always loved the X-Men and the wide variety of characters, people from all walks of life and with all sorts of different powers and how those powers come to define them and how they come to define themselves in spite of their powers. A very interesting comic written by Joss Whedon of Buffy the Vampire Slayer fame, and ended up directing the Avengers. Actually got the job because he had written a comic called The Astounding X-Men, where Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men, loses his ability to shoot lasers out of his eyes and still ends up being the leader because he's very, intelligent and understands how people work with each other, even though he tends not to work very well with anybody. But that complexity to his character was really important to that story and shows how good a writer Joss Whedon is. Yeah, well, here I am talking about comics. I only talked about Deadpool for a little bit here, but it's funny to realize how I've got a scratchy throat, excuse me. Oh, I figured out why I was getting stuffed up in here. We've taken a whole bunch of stuff out of the kitchen and stored it in the guest room. It hasn't been dusted in a decade at least, and now it's getting into me, and that's probably why I'm coughing in here. Because I can talk for 10 minutes to this thing, no problem every night, but tonight, for whatever reason, I'm getting a scratchy throat. Yeah, so see Deadpool. And hopefully, now that it looks like Fox is going to be owned by Disney, all of those characters are going to be under one roof, except for the ones that Sony has certain claims to. Venom and Spider-Man, but Spider-Man's pretty okay. I would love to see the comics sort of reflect the bringing everything back under one roof aspect of that. We'll see. But for now, I'm Eric Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.